She just wanted to have a routine checkup. She put on her simplest blouse, tied her hair as usual, and without much thought, wore her mother's necklace, the one with the oval pendant, which she almost never took off. In the waiting room, she was leafing through an old magazine when a nurse approached, eyes fixed on the necklace. She lightly touched her arm and said in a low, urgent tone, "Leave here as quickly as possible." The sentence kept echoing, stronger than any examination. Hello, my friends. I am Linda, and this is the Linda's Stories channel. I hope you enjoy this story. The air was heavy in the room, as if the unspoken words between Emily and her mother, Virginia, floated there. Sitting in the worn leather armchair, Emily watched her mother asleep on the couch. The book Virginia had been reading before dozing off was still open on her chest, rising and falling with her breathing. It was an ordinary, almost mundane scene, but Emily captured it mentally as one takes an important photograph. At 35, Emily had built a life of her own, a small but cosy apartment, a job as a graphic designer that offered her stability, and a circle of friends that made up for the absence of a lasting relationship. Her life was organized and predictable, except for these visits to her mother's house, which always brought her an uncomfortable mix of duty and nostalgia. Virginia hadn't been a perfect mother. She raised Emily alone after Emily's father left them when she was only 5 years old. Life was never easy for the two of them. Virginia worked herself to exhaustion, and when she finally arrived home, she barely had the strength to give Emily the affection the girl longed for. But loneliness weighed more than the exhaustion, and some time after her husband's abandonment, a new man entered Virginia's life for a short period. He occupied her thoughts, her heart. And at the time, Emily felt betrayed by her mother. The years dragged on, and with them came silent grievances. Emily grew up holding on to every absence, every broken promise, every time her mother chose someone else over her. Even when Virginia, now regretful, tried to make amends, the resentment had already taken deep root. Even so, deep down, love had never ceased to exist. It had only been lost along the way, suffocated by wrong choices and prolonged silences. "Are you leaving already?" Virginia's voice, still sleepy, surprised Emily, who was packing her bag. "Yes, I have some work to finish," Emily replied, trying to avoid extending the conversation. "You always have work, don't you?" Virginia commented, with no accusation, but with a sad note that Emily preferred to ignore. It had been like this for years. Superficial conversations, comments about the weather, polite questions about work and health. Nothing that touched the heart or reopened old wounds. A formal dialogue between two people who, despite sharing blood, had become almost strangers. The previous year, the phone call came on a typical Tuesday. "Your mother is in the hospital," said Virginia's neighbour, a lady with a calm voice whom Emily only knew by sight. "She fainted at the market." The following days were a blur of hospital corridors, forms and medical terms that Emily quickly learned. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. The prognosis was guarded, as the doctors would say with their professional euphemisms, instead of directly saying, "Your mother is dying." Emily managed the logistics of the illness with the same efficiency she applied to her professional projects. She organized folders with tests, created spreadsheets with medications and schedules, coordinated appointments. It was easier to handle the illness this way, through tasks and practical responsibilities. It was a way to care without having to open up, without having to dive into the deep waters of what they really felt for each other. One afternoon in March, 4 months after the diagnosis, Emily arrived at her mother's house with a new medical prescription. She found Virginia sitting on the porch, looking at the small garden she loved so much but no longer had the strength to tend to. The late afternoon sun illuminated her pale face, highlighting the dark circles and the expression lines deepened by the illness. "I brought the new medicine," Emily said, placing the bag on the table. Virginia just nodded, not taking her eyes off the roses that were beginning to wilt in the flower beds. Then, with a slow movement, she removed a simple necklace from her neck, a silver chain with a small oval pendant. "I want you to have it, okay?" she said, extending the necklace in the palm of her hand. Emily picked it up, confused. She had never given much importance to that piece. It was beautiful, but simple, without gemstones or elaborate details. The oval pendant had an engraved pattern that resembled waves or perhaps a starry sky. It was hard to tell. "Why?" Emily almost asked, but the words died in her throat. Deep down she feared the answer. She feared it was a farewell. "Thank you," was all she could say, placing the necklace in her pocket. That silent gesture hung between them like an unspoken conversation, a bridge neither of them had the courage to cross. But some time later, contrary to medical expectations, Virginia responded well to the treatment. Weeks turned into months, and the critical phase of the disease was gradually overcome. Emily remained present, but always kept that emotional distance. They spoke, but did not converse. They were together, but separated by decades of accumulated silences. The necklace remained in Emily's drawer for almost a year, alongside other small mementos, an old birthday card, a faded photo of a trip to the beach, reminiscences of a time when communication seemed easier, before grievances and unspoken words created an abyss between them. On a February morning, Emily woke up feeling slightly unwell. Nothing serious, just a persistent discomfort that had been bothering her for a few weeks. She decided to schedule a routine appointment at a medical clinic in the city centre, a large building with various offices. Before leaving, on an impulse she couldn't explain, she opened the drawer and took her mother's necklace, which was now hers. She looked at the pendant for a few seconds, running her finger over its textured surface. It was a unique necklace, with a vividly coloured stone. Then she put it around her neck, feeling the cold metal against her skin. The clinic was bustling that morning. Emily filled out the form at the reception and sat in the waiting room, idly flipping through a magazine. She didn't immediately notice the nurse's glances, a middle-aged woman with greying hair tied in a discreet bun. "Mrs. Martins," called the receptionist. Emily stood up and walked toward the hallway that led to the offices when she felt a gentle hand on her arm. It was the nurse with the greying hair. "Sorry to bother you," she began, her voice slightly trembling. "That necklace belonged to Virginia, didn't it?" Emily stopped, surprised. The necklace was partially hidden by the collar of her blouse, but somehow the woman had noticed it. "Yes. She gave it to me. It belonged to my mother," she replied, watching the nurse's expression change. There was something familiar about that face, but Emily couldn't pinpoint where she knew her from. The woman smiled, her eyes suddenly welling up with tears. "How is she? Is she okay?" she asked, with an anxiety that did not match the professional setting of the clinic. "She is. She got better. She's fine," replied Emily, feeling strangely vulnerable in the face of the genuine emotion of that stranger. The nurse sighed, relieved, perhaps believing Virginia had passed away, and for a moment Emily thought she might hug her. But the woman only adjusted the badge on her white uniform, which read Barbara. "What a fright. I'm so happy. Your mother told me back then that she just wanted one more Christmas with you. I'm glad she got it. She was so brave." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. One Christmas, it was such a small request, so simple and at the same time, so immense. She felt the weight of all the Christmases they had spent together, but separated by invisible walls of resentments and misunderstandings. Did you work at the hospital where she stayed?" Emily asked, trying to understand. "Yes, I was her nurse during her hospitalization. I was there when she received the diagnosis." Barbara paused, as if assessing whether she should continue. "She spoke a lot about you, about how proud she was of the woman you became, despite all the difficulties." Emily swallowed hard, feeling a knot forming in her throat. Proud? Virginia had never said that to her, never directly. I didn't know," was all she could say. Barbara smiled, understandingly. "Sometimes it's hard to say these things, isn't it? Especially when there is already so much distance," She looked at the necklace again. Did you know that this necklace has a special story? Emily shook her head, curious. Her mother had never mentioned anything about the necklace other than the, "I want you to have it." Your mother told me it was your grandmother's. It was given to her by your grandfather when they were still dating, before the war. The pendant has the date they met. When your grandfather returned, they got married, and years later, when he passed away, your grandmother gave the necklace to Virginia. Emily touched the pendant, looking at it with new eyes. It was a very special object for her mother, preserved through generations. She said she wanted you to have something to remember where you came from, who you came from, Barbara continued in a gentle voice. Something that would connect you even when words failed. The receptionist called again, but Emily barely heard. She was lost in the implications of that revelation, in the layers of meaning that her mother's simple act carried. Barbara leaned slightly, as if confiding something important, and said, "Can I give you some advice? Get out of here as soon as possible, and go hug your mother. I lost mine a long time ago and I miss her every day." Emily looked at the clock. Her appointment would start in a few minutes, so she decided to stay, but was determined to take action. The nurse nodded, lightly squeezing her arm before stepping away to attend to another patient. On the way home, Emily drove in silence, her mind filled with memories. She remembered when she was little, and Virginia, despite being tired after hours of work, would sit on the edge of her bed to read stories. The times when her mother would sew late into the night to make her graduation dress because they couldn't afford a new one. How Virginia would always save the last piece of cake for her, even when Emily knew her mother wanted it too. Small acts of love that she had taken as obligations, or simply ignored, too busy with her own hurts and unmet expectations. The necklace seemed to weigh more on her neck. It was not just metal and memories. It was a lineage of strong women, a chain of love that persisted despite difficulties, silences, and unspoken words. Without warning, Emily drove to her mother's house. It was almost 6 in the evening when she parked on the quiet street. The living room lights were on, and through the window she could see Virginia sitting in her armchair, doing crossword puzzles, a habit she had maintained for decades. She rang the doorbell, feeling an almost adolescent anxiety. "Emily?" Virginia seemed surprised when she opened the door. "Did something happen?" "No. Yes, I just—" Emily hesitated, the words caught in her throat. "Can I come in?" They sat in the kitchen while Virginia made tea. It was a familiar scene, almost comforting in its predictability. Emily watched her mother move with more vigour than the previous year, her white hair styled as always, her hands still nimble despite the arthritis. "I met a nurse today," Emily began as her mother placed the cups on the table. "She took care of you in the hospital." Virginia paused for a moment before continuing to pour the tea. "Barbara?" "Yes," Emily confirmed, surprised. "Do you remember her?" "Of course I do. She was very kind to me," Virginia said, sitting down and blowing on the hot tea. "How is she?" "Well, I think so. She—" Emily touched the necklace, and Virginia followed the movement with her eyes. "She told me about the necklace, about its history." A silence settled between them. It wasn't a tense silence, like the many they had shared over the years. It was an expectant silence, as if the air was full of possibilities. "It was your grandmother's," Virginia finally said. "She gave it to me when your father left. She said it was to remind me that not all men are the same, and that there is love that remains, even when it seems impossible." Emily felt her eyes burning. So many stories she had never heard, so many fragments of her mother's life that she did not know. "Why did you never tell me that?" Virginia shrugged, a gesture that seemed at once resigned and defensive. "You have always been so independent, Emily, since you were little. I thought you wouldn't be interested in these old stories." She paused, her eyes fixed on the cup. "And then it became difficult to talk about anything important." "I know," Emily admitted, feeling the weight of years of superficial conversations and obligatory visits. "I'm sorry for that." Virginia looked up, surprised. "You have nothing to apologize for. It was me who didn't know how—" "No," Emily interrupted. "Both of us. Neither of us knew how." Another silence, lighter. The tea cooled in the cups. "When you gave me the necklace, I thought it was—" Emily did not finish the sentence. "A farewell?" Virginia smiled sadly. "In a way it was. The doctors weren't giving me much time. I wanted you to have something of mine. Something of ours." Emily held her mother's hand over the table. It was a small hand, with prominent veins and age spots, but still strong. A hand that had worked tirelessly, that had stroked her forehead on feverish nights, that had held hers in days of fear and uncertainty. "Do you know what Barbara told me today?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "That you only wanted one more Christmas with me." Virginia lowered her eyes, as if ashamed of such a simple and profound wish. "I wanted much more than one," she admitted in a low voice. But back then, even one seemed like an impossible miracle. Emily felt the tears running down her face. Without thinking, she stood up and walked over to her mother's side. She knelt down next to the chair, as she did when she was a child, and embraced her. For the first time in a long while, without guilt, without haste. They stayed like that for a long moment, while the clock on the wall marked the passing time. The time they still had together. "We don't have to wait until Christmas," Emily said, still in her mother's arms. "We can start now." When they finally separated, Virginia smiled, her eyes also moist. "You know what your grandmother always said. Love is like the stars. Even when we can't see it, it's still there." "I think she was right," she said, holding her mother's hand again. That night they didn't talk about all the past grievances. They didn't open up all the old wounds. There was time for that if they wanted. But they sat together on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the sky, while Emily listened, for the first time, to the family stories her mother kept as treasures. Because love between a mother and daughter can be full of cracks, but it never ceases to exist. Sometimes all it takes is a gesture, simple, sincere, to remind us that there is still time, and that silent love also deserves a voice. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 5 to show how much you liked it. Also, watch the video that is now appearing on your screen. See you soon.